My dog was lost for 3 days. What came back wasn't my dog. Published by Chewing Skin. Narrated by Kyle Norris. And audio production by Felipe Ojeda. As a kid, I was raised in a small fishing community on the eastern side of Canada, surrounded by the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the boreal forest. The entirety of the land was close to 4,000 square foot, with an even smaller number of residents sprawled out over Main Street, the main road running straight through our little town, and farming houses spread widely between areas of trees that were changed to domestic residential homes when agriculture stopped being profitable. In total, our community is surrounded by a vast expanse of ocean, and a seemingly endless barrage of trees that spread over 55% of Canada's entire country. I spent most of my life hunting in those woods, so you can imagine my joy when my parents got me a hunting dog. Sandy was a Shetland sheepdog, and while they were more fit to be herding and tracking sheep over grassy plains rather than rabbits and deer through dense forest, it didn't stop me from taking him with me on every excursion I possibly could. Sandy had been by my side for enough hunting trips that he'd grown accustomed to waking up just before breaking daylight, and on a few occasions helped track down small game like squirrels and rabbits through considerably large areas of forest. Sandy wasn't my property, and wasn't treated like he belonged to me. Sandy was a member of the family, my best companion, and my truest friend. I think fondly back on all the times he'd sit in the front seat of the truck without being told, ready to go for a walk in whatever part of the forest I took him to. I can honestly say that there will never be a dog that will fill the void Sandy left in my life. I find that dog lovers relate to that sentiment more than others. It was October 30th, the first day of deer hunting season. I had been talking with my family about taking Sandy, my hunting gear, and some essentials to one of the cabins my grandfather owned in his heyday, off an unmarked road a few hundred miles into the wilderness for a few days. This was met with a lot of protesting, but nothing could stop me from getting in some time looking for wild game in an area that wasn't already picked clean by illegal hunters earlier on in the month. Everything was packed into an old blue Ford, Sandy included. And a few hours of driving later, we were setting up camp in one of my grandfather's secluded old cabins. Here's where things got fucked up. Sandy, I'm so sorry. I had spent most of the time of my life being in the wilderness. There were only a handful of times that things had gotten weird for me, but usually everything can be explained with scientific reason. That's why I brushed off Sandy's weirdness on the first few nights, chalking it up to the nervousness of a dog that's capable of hearing the far-off noises of various coyotes, wolves, bears, and moose. This was untouched territory, of course. There had been plenty of time for wildlife to set up camp here, too. The first night was fairly normal. I had set up Sandy's bed in the corner of the living room next to the TV that looked like it came out of the early 90s. I figured I'd give Sandy the option to have some place to lay down for a while, despite the fact that he slept curled up with me 9 times out of 10. Close to 10 at night, Sandy looked straight at the wooden door and whined. I figured he needed to piss and opened the door to let him out, not worried about having my best friend stray too far from me. Instead, he sat just inside the door, looking out at the forest's edge beyond the path. I too stood and looked for a few minutes before deciding he had just heard an errant critter close to the cabin. The rest of the night was fairly normal, and Sandy slept with me fine. The second night, I chalked up the weirdness to Sandy's stress. Earlier in the day, we had been walking a few miles through the woods beyond the house, and I thought I had heard the sound of twigs crackling under something heavy. I hoped it wasn't a moose because my shotgun wouldn't have stood a chance. But something changed in Sandy that I didn't pay close attention to at the time. He hunched himself on his hind legs, his front pressed close to the ground, his mouth pulled up over his teeth, and he growled towards nothingness. I figured we'd try hunting again later if whatever it was had left and should he be filling up to it. But once we were inside, he didn't want to move. Even when I tried to get him to go outside and do his business, he sat at the door and cried, wailing at me to let me know he didn't want to go out there. I didn't pressure him. If he pissed on the floor, so be it. Sandy never acted up before. I could excuse an accident or two if he really didn't want to go out there. It must have been a bear, I thought, before locking the door and calling it a night. The third night is where things went to hell, and I still don't fully understand what happened. Sandy didn't eat all day. I managed to shoot a rabbit in the early morning, and when Sandy decided he didn't want to be outside any longer than he had to, he retired inside for the day. I cooked it up, threw a little gravy on it, and gave it to him. I didn't do this all the time, but I figured now was a special occasion. Maybe a treat would put him in a better mood for another walk the next day. Sandy didn't touch it. He didn't so much as sniff it. Instead, he sat at my side on the couch, watching the doorway intently. So I tucked him under one of my arms, and he laid his head on my lap, eyes still locked on that door. Close to 3 hours of watching grainy VHS tapes on an outdated television set, Sandy started crying, hugging himself close to my body. This is where my judgment took me down the wrong path for the first time of many. It must sound silly being my dog's protector rather than my dog being mine, but this was my family. I figured if there was something out there that was scaring Sandy so bad, then it was my job to do something about it. I loaded my 410, opened the door, stood in the doorway, and waited. I must have waited at least half an hour staring into nothing. There was barely any sound, save for the faint buzz of insects and leaf rustling in the cold autumn wind. Moose aren't elegant creatures, and if there were a moose, I would have heard it coming. Around the 40-minute mark, Sandy took off like a shot into the darkness of the trees beyond the path, barking wildly. I started to get worried, despite my knowledge that my dog isn't entirely helpless in the wilderness. There were still bigger animals that would have liked to take a bite out of him if there wasn't a lot of food for the winter. I heard Sandy's bark fade away in the distance, and then stop altogether. I waited hours, standing in the doorway with my shotgun cocked and ready to put down whatever it was that was waiting in the woods. I waited hours for Sandy to come back to the house. I waited until the sun was cracking through the trees, and then I waited until the night, sitting on my porch step, feigning off sleep deprivation to see my dog come back. Sandy did come back, but not for another 3 days. Fog had rolled in at that point, and it was getting darker, the night painting the sky a navy blue. Tracking over the last few days proved futile, and I started to get worried that I'd need to leave and find more provisions to last me the next few nights. I couldn't leave Sandy up here, lost in the woods, cold and probably hungry. The thought that he might be waiting out there for me to find him and bring him back to the home was distressing enough. I was packing the bag that hung on the coat rack next to the door with what I would need for the next day's trip. I figured tomorrow would be the last day before I'd go into town and see if my father would help me find Sandy. He was a retired, graying man, but I was sure if I brought Sandy's name up, he'd be more than willing to help me search and find him. Thankfully, Sandy came back before I even finished that train of thought. I saw him from the window, on the path that led down the main road, a few dozen feet away from the house. Normally, I'd hear him scamper to the doorway and paw at the door a few times, eager to come in. But this was different. I could see the reflection of his eyes as green pearls in the murky fog that had swamped the house. For a moment, I thought it might be an animal, but the outline of his body and the wisps of the thick, low-lying clouds was unmistakable. Still, despite myself, I hesitated. There was something different about his body language. I stared out the window for a few more moments before reason overcame my gut instinct. Sandy could be hurt, I thought, or worse. I flung the doorway open, but he didn't come right away. Instead, he stood there watching me intently. And when he didn't move, I whistled to him. "Shh, here, Sandy." I coaxed him towards the house. "Here, boy." The way he moved was different. It was as though his hips had been dislocated, and the angle of his paws changed direction with every step, as though he'd forgotten how to walk properly. His head was bowed to the ground, but his teeth weren't bared. He didn't seem aggressive. The only way I could describe the look he gave me was sheepish. Like he'd just gotten into something he wasn't supposed to, and I yelled at him for it. I thought he might hurt himself hopping up onto the elevated step if he had dislocated his hips. But he did just fine. His back half swung a little, oddly enough, and his paws almost folded underneath himself. But he didn't go sprawling. He sat on the step and didn't take his look off me. It wasn't until I had moved from the doorway completely, opened the door wide, and waited for him to walk in that he had moved. Straight to his bed. He didn't stop at my hand and sniff at me. He didn't wait for pets or jump up on me like he used to. It was straight to his bed, where he sat and watched me for quite some time afterwards. I returned to the movie at hand. I called to him a few times, but he didn't respond. His ears didn't so much as rise at the sound of my voice, or the pat of my hand on the worn-out couch beside me. I had missed my buddy, but I wasn't about to move him physically towards me. There was something about him that said I shouldn't have let him in. But I chalked it up to silliness, and a few hours later I went to bed. The more I think back on it, I don't recall him blinking once. He sat there like a statue. And when I turned off the light, I could still see the reflection of a jade green following me as I went into my room and shut the door. I could have sworn I heard him walk in the night, the sound of nails clicking against the wooden floor coming up to the door of my room, but they were slow and deliberate. They weren't like the quickness of Sandy realizing I'd gone to bed and coming up to curl. I heard the noise stop outside of my bedroom, but I didn't hear his whine. I thought nothing of it and fell into a deep sleep. When I woke in the morning, I figured it must have been a dream. Sandy was still sitting in the upright position I left him in when I went to bed. It was as though he didn't move a muscle the entire night. And when I said good morning, he didn't so much as wag his tail. He did follow me into the kitchen, but he paused at the doorway when I put his bowl down on the floor and filled it up with supermarket dog food. Once again, his back half moved weirdly as he slowly made his way toward me. There was a nagging feeling that something was off-putting about the way he looked that day. It was like he had gotten a little longer overnight. Sandy hunched down again, like when he was walking to the door the night before. He didn't come into the kitchen. I figured he must have been hungry being out in the wild for so long, but he eyed me like he was waiting for me to come a little closer rather than to touch the food. It goes without saying, but after a few moments of a staring contest between me and my unblinking dog, I called off that foolishness and called his name out loudly. Sandy. Not even a flinch. I didn't want to move closer to my dog to leave the kitchen floor, but this was my Sandy. And the most damage he'd ever done was eat flies. Sure enough, I passed him, he turned, and his body swayed unnaturally. But he didn't move towards me. When I left that day, I couldn't find anything. The deer tracks in the mud were made a few days prior, but went cold on naturally made trails through the woods. I couldn't hear bugs or birds or even the howl of a nearby coyote. The only sounds for miles was my own breathing and the sound of crunching leaves under my feet. When the sun began to set, I started making my way back, but I should have packed my shit and left. just behind a cluster of trees, with the house just visible beyond the rise. I figured I found out the reason why the animals had abandoned this place. Generally, when there are mass animal deaths, that usually means that something is wrong in the area of the slaughter, and the wildlife are usually smart enough to get the hell out of Dodge. Even cats are bred instinctively not to like drinking from water that is close to where their food is, because if you saw a dead animal close to a stream, you'd figure the stream was tainted and find another source of water. Hundreds of squirrels were disemboweled and strewn across the grass in an almost perfect circle. Most of them were skinned alive, but when I turned to heave up all the contents in my stomach, there were a few that were turned inside out. I couldn't help but vomit repeatedly as I tried my best to walk around the circle of tiny organs and mashed up bodies. Not just over the sight, but because the smell was ungodly. I don't know how long they'd been out there, but if I'd stumbled across this sooner, I'd have left with Sandy in tow immediately after. Gradually, the bodies stopped and delved off into a random dead squirrel here and there. The biggest thing I managed to find, just a few feet off the unholy feeding ground, was a deer. It looked as though something had decided to skin it alive from hide to neck, and draped some of the skin over a branch like someone was tanning a hide. I don't know how long it had been there, but it smelled like it had been dead for quite some time, despite the fact that there wasn't a single fucking fly. The head had been cut off clean, just above the shoulders, and when I realized the organs had been removed, I moved from a walking pace through the forest to a jog. Thankfully, the cabin wasn't too far off. I heaved one final time, wiped my mouth off on the back of my sleeve, and looked up to the house to see Sandy watching me from the window. I tried to reason with myself and tell myself Sandy's odd behavior could have been trauma. I know it's stupid to think of it now, but at the time, it was the only reasonable explanation I had to keep myself from going insane. The elongating body could have just been the loneliness getting to me. Sandy had realized there was something up with this place, and the second he noticed it, I should have taken his warning and taken off back to town. Once the door was shut behind me, I started packing the food and essentials back into boxes, moving quickly to try and get my things into the truck before night came. It'd be dangerous to try and maneuver my way through the trails at night, as the hills off Kelly's Mountain were steep, and in pitch darkness, with my only companion being my headlights, it would have been easy to slide off a ravine and never be heard from again. I didn't want to stay one more night, but I had no choice. I had gotten back to the house just moments before the sun finally receded past the horizon, and we were bathed in a navy blue sky once again. I didn't pay attention to Sandy. He just sat at his bed and watched me pack. I figured no harm, no foul. I'd throw his stuff in the truck in the morning, and we'd be back in town before night the next day. Glancing at him for just a moment, it was a passing thought that he was looking a little longer today. And when I went to bed, it was a hard time getting to sleep for the next few hours. It must have been close to 4 or 5 in the morning when I heard it. The sound of whistling. The same whistle I used to call my dog. I broke out into a cold sweat when I realized that whoever slaughtered those squirrels, hung the skin up, left what he didn't need, could have very well broken into my house. The door to my room didn't make a sound as I opened it slowly, thankfully. I waited a moment, listening to someone call my dog for a few more seconds before I dared poke my head out from the door frame to get a good look at whoever it was that could have hurt Sandy. The outside door was open. All I saw was the back half of Sandy, too long and lanky, almost coiled around the back of the door. His front half was outside. Whatever it was that had impersonated my dog, it was whistling slowly, calling for Sandy, when I could have sworn that it had hunched down to the ground again and said, "Sandy," in the most ungodly voice I'd ever fucking heard. I closed the door, just as softly as I had opened it, I don't know how long I waited with my back pressed up against the door. I knew I left my gun in the bag on the coat rack. I know I didn't sleep. I waited until I saw the sun break over the horizon, and then I waited some more, until it must have been midday and I finally got the balls to open the door again and make a break for the truck. I wouldn't die in that place. Sandy was gone, and the door was open. His food was untouched, but the fridge was open and all the meat was gone. I didn't bother packing his stuff. I just threw my bag over my shoulder, made my way to the Ford as fast as I could, and turned on the ignition. I can't describe the feeling that overcame me as I realized that I'd have to leave Sandy in this place. The thought that he could be dead was never a thought in my mind. I don't think I can cope with the knowledge that whatever I allowed into my house, whatever disemboweled those animals, could have done the same with him. I made my way down the winding paths and roads as fast as I possibly could without veering off the cliffs. I felt like I was turning in circles down this labyrinth that would take me back to the house. But when I reached the pavement on the stretch of road back to town, I felt relief wash over me, thinking I was safe. Just as I was pulling off onto the cement, I felt something hard hit the back of the windshield, sending broken glass into the passenger seat. I only got a glimpse of the deer's decapitated head catching on unbroken glass and tumbling into the back seat. I cried for most of the way home, hands clenching the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white. I wish I could leave this off with a positive note. I wish I could tell you that I found Sandy at home waiting for me. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, a traumatizing experience in the woods that I'll get over with time. Last night I found it hard to sleep. I kept replaying the entirety of my trip to Kelly's Mountain in my head. I figured I wouldn't be sleeping for a while. I laid there, listening to the wind through my open window. I could have sworn I heard the whistle I used to call my dog with, coming from the forest's edge. If you go on trips with your dog, I advise you that you don't let him out of your sight for too long. What comes back might not be your dog.
There were rumors going around about some abandoned old silo that loomed over the woods. The woods were located in the middle of a field of just dirt alongside the railroad tracks. Not like anyone cares. It's an eerie sight with just, sitting there looming over the woods with rust trailing down the sides. Anyways, some rumored it to be haunted by some old farmer who hung himself in the silo and takes his revenge on anyone who enters. I say this rumor is complete bullshit, especially the one spreading the rumor tries to back it up with a rumor with a story of some stupid kids who were curious and went into the silo, never to come back out. Others say the silo is just a good hangout spot, where people can never find them. So with both positive and negative comments, my geek band of friends and I decided to check it out. We decided to enhance the creepiness by choosing to visit the silo on a gloomy and cloudy day. So the day came and my friends, Pete, Meg, and Wes, met at my house since it was alongside the railway. We walked along the railway, talking and laughing, having ourselves a good time, until we saw it. The silo was, of course, just sitting there, looming over all the trees. Curious, we walked towards it as our laughter, along with our talking, died down. The closer we got to it, the colder it felt, as if there was some sort of cold, dark aura radiating from it, sending shivers down our spines. Hell, Wes even let out a small little yelp. We paced around the circumference of the silo, looking for an entrance of some sort. We ended up finding a ladder leading up into the silo. The rungs of the ladder were also handles to open hatches along the sides of the structure. All were locked, except for one. Though it was stuck, so we had Pete climb up and open the hatch, and within a few minutes, we were inside the silo, standing on the hay left in there. In the center, there was a large hole, deep in the hay. It was dark, but we could hear a steady flow of air coming from the bottom. Oddly enough, there was a rope descending into the hole. Since I was the only one smart enough to actually be prepared for this, I took out my flashlight. Holding the flashlight in my mouth, I began to descend. I dropped to the bottom, scanning the small area. Everything seemed safe as I looked at the scattered hay, dirt, and also another peculiar hatch. I beckoned for the others to come down. As they descended, my eyes caught something covering the rope. The color of it was red. I hid my panic and showed the others the hatch I had found. Pete opened it, revealing a dark hole. Now, the fucked up thing about that was that it reeked of death. The others had sensed it too, and of course Wes had whimpered like a little bitch. Meg ended up gaining the courage to take my flashlight and go first into the hole. We followed her and we walked through this dark tunnel for about 10 to 15 minutes until Meg had told us we reached another hatch and she opened it. A bright light had filled the tunnel, and that's when we heard it. A piercing shriek, followed by the sound of something running, panting hard. In a desperate attempt to avoid the creature that had made that horrific shriek, we ran. Once we were out of the tunnel, we slammed the hatch shut, attempting to lock it. The sound had stopped, and breathing a sigh of relief, all of us had observed our current surroundings. We were in a concrete block, which appeared to be an old septic tank, but with an opening at the top, and through that opening, we could see the forest above. We began to climb out, and then it happened. Again, we heard that damn sound again. Wes wasn't even out of the hole yet. Poor Wes. This creature slammed through the hatch, and a sharp clawed hand reached out and grasped Wes's leg tight, pulling him into the tunnel. We heard his terrified screams, and then suddenly, it stopped. We heard the sharp snapping of bones and the tearing of flesh. The rest of us were frozen in shock. The sound of Wes being killed was revolting. Meg ended up vomiting at the sound. After that, we tried to find our way out of the thicket. We searched for a way out for at least an hour, but we concluded that the forest was enclosed in a large perimeter of barbed wire fencing. We panicked, having no idea what we should do, and also realizing that the thing comes out in the dark. Night was coming fast, and in a desperate panic, Meg climbed into a tree, hoping the thing wouldn't find her. Pete found a small hole in the ground to hide in. Bad idea. Again, we heard the shriek, and I watched the thing climb out of its home. In my panic, I quickly climbed up a tree and watched Pete sitting in the hole. Also, to my regret, I got a better look at the creature we were facing. It was the most grotesque thing I had ever seen. Its face was mask-like, pale white against its dark skin. The face seemed to have 2 dark holes for eyes and a large smile stretched across the face. After a few moments of observation, I had soon noticed that it was a mask. A mask made from Wes's skinned face. I was scared shitless as the thing crawled towards Pete. I sat in the tree as I watched Pete run in fear, but there was no use since the thing caught up to him instantly. It shoved both hands through Pete's chest and tore him apart with ease. Oh God. Its chest opened up, revealing bloody tendrils that wrapped around Pete's head, tearing it off from his mutilated corpse, slowly pulling it into the empty cavity and sealed it shut. The skinned face of Wes was disintegrated and quickly replaced with a mask made from Pete, with the same hollow eyes and screwed up smile. Then it spoke in a soft, raspy voice.
I am the pocket.
I proceeded to crawl back into its dwelling. From the other tree, I heard Meg crying. I beckoned for her to climb down as I climbed down myself, and I told her we were getting the hell out of this place alive. Hesitantly, she climbed down, and I went to the barbed wire fence and gripped the sharp wire, spreading it wide enough for someone to climb through. My hands bled, but I ignored the pain as Meg climbed through the opening. Again, the pocket shrieked, and in my panic, I hastily crawled through the opening and cut myself up bad. Bleeding, I ran with Meg and ignored the pain, running until we reached civilization once again. 10 years had passed. Meg and I were happily married. I said were for a reason. The same reason why I'm telling you this story today. Meg is dead. She died a horrible death. So horrible. The police were called to the scene after a couple going for a walk through the woods found her mutilated, headless corpse lying at the edge of the woods. When I say the word edge, that means that it was far from the barbed wire fence. This can only mean that the pocket is free from its prison. It's free. It's coming straight for me. I know it is. This is horrible. Right now, I'm looking at our marriage pictures, trying to calm myself down with the happy memories. It didn't help because in the reflection of the glass, I saw a face slowly coming towards me. Meg's face. Only it was eyeless and had that damn terrifying smile. The pocket. It's here. It has come to take me. I feel its hands pierce through my chest. At this moment, I realize its prime motive. It killed to free people from the hell that now exists in this world.
And I earn the privilege to be free. I smile.
Rabbits in the Creek. Performed by Felipe Ojeda. An audio production by the Ghost of 94. I'm writing this because my family won't talk about it anymore. I'm the only one who can't seem to forget. I was raised in the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of around 5,000. My more immediate community was an isolated dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. Less than 20 families lived in Bear Creek. I didn't mind being so isolated. I grew up in the comfort of wide fields and close neighbors that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-centered, very community-centered. All the young girls were part of the young women's group, and all the boys were members of the local Boy Scout troop, which doubled as a church group in our area. We had 4th of July parties at the local ballpark and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a good, quiet community. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, was situated on a small hill surrounded by a wide grass field on one side and a snaking dirt road on the other. Across the road was the creek bottoms. Southern Idaho is categorized as a desert climate, so not much grows outside the irrigated fields besides sagebrush and burrs. The creek bottoms were the exception. The creek fed the growth of a thick tangle of pussy willow bushes. In the late fall, we used to go down into the bottoms and pick the white cottony pussy willow seeds to decorate the fences of our driveway. Being so isolated, it wasn't uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains. We had a female moose who brought her calf down and lived in our orchard every winter, and the occasional lion wasn't unheard of either. The summer, when I turned 8, I remember because it was the same year as my baptism. A smaller mountain lion was spotted several times in our area. We weren't worried. The big cats stayed away from the farms and usually moved on when the area didn't yield enough food. That same summer, my neighbor, Peyton, was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be pretty cool to try putting together a National Geographic submission on our little creek bottoms. The young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time made him especially excited. He decided he wanted to try and get pictures of the lion and emailed the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that takes shots every couple of seconds in the area the lion was known to visit. They also recommended setting up some kind of bait so the lion would be more likely to come by. No one in the creek liked the idea of live bait or carry-on, so we came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to set up an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it on a loop through a set of speakers hidden in the willows. I remember when everyone was down in the bottoms testing the speakers, and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of a dying rabbit is horrible. It's been described as being almost identical to the sound of a screaming child. If you've never heard it yourself, there's plenty of recordings available online. It's worth a listen. The camera was set up, the speakers were set up. Everything was perfect. Peyton explained that he would allow the camera and recording to play uninterrupted for a week, and then he would go and check on it. This would give time for our scent to fade from the bottoms and encourage the lion to come closer. At first, I was worried about the noise. It was a truly horrible noise, and our house was the closest to the setup point in the bottoms. My father assured me that the noise wouldn't reach as far as our house. I was relieved when we arrived home that night, and he was correct. The bottoms were far enough away that I couldn't hear anything. I remember Peyton the next day at church. He was fidgety and excited to go check on the equipment. But he had to wait a week, which everybody kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down too early and scaring the lion away for good. That night, I woke up to an awful noise. I sat, ramrod straight in my bed with my eyes wide in the dark. Hands clenched so hard my palms bore the indents of my fingernails for hours after. I knew that noise. It was the recording of the rabbit. It sounded faint and far off, like it really could have been coming from the bottoms. But it was impossible, because the recording had been going all night the previous day, and I hadn't heard a thing. didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of bed and wake my parents. The recording played over and over again. I had the loop memorized. In the morning, I stumbled into the kitchen for breakfast. My mom and dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark rings under their eyes. I hadn't been the only one who heard it. Mom was convinced the equipment must have been broken. She wanted to go down into the bottoms to check it out. Dad refused. He was a kind, gentle man and didn't want to stir up any unnecessary drama. He was sure there had been a strong wind last night, and the wind was carrying the noise further than its natural reach. He told us to listen. We did. He was right. We couldn't hear it now. We forgot about it and went about our daily goings. The next night, it happened again. The screaming was even louder than before, but this time something was different. It was lower pitched than I remembered, and parts of the loop were slowed down as if the recording were warped in places. At times, the loop didn't loop naturally, and instead picked up in a random place in the middle. My mom didn't mention anything at the breakfast table, but both her and my dad seemed tense. The third night, I mustered up the courage to stand beside my bedroom window and look out into the yard. For a moment I stood, rooted to the spot, my hands shaking no matter how hard I clenched them. The noise slid through the cracks in the window. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred their branches. My mom announced that she would be going to visit her sister in town the next day, and would probably spend the night there. She invited me to come, but I wanted to stay on the farm with my dad. I took Mom's place beside Dad in their bed that night, but even that didn't help. I don't think my dad slept either, for he was unnaturally still the whole night. We began to hear the noise during the day, too. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. There was only one scream, a short, high-pitched one, and then the recording fell silent. It happened again several times throughout the day, but never the whole loop, just clips from it. Later that evening, Peyton's dad came up the driveway on his four-wheeler. He said he was looking for their dog, a sweet yellow lab who had been missing since that morning. Dad said he was sorry and that he hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the recording, but he didn't. He was a quiet man after all. He didn't want to bring up any unnecessary drama. Mom stayed away the whole week. Dad and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, the screaming could be heard constantly, though it seemed to have deviated from the familiar loop entirely. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screams were thin and long, and other times they were hardly more than growls. Once, while my dad had been heating up meatloaf for lunch, the noise rose into such a raucous din that he dropped the plate and it shattered. I pressed my hands over my ears where I sat at the table and squeezed my eyes shut. But it didn't help. The noise forced its way through the cracks of my fingers and pinched my throat and rattled my rib cage. The din lasted for a whole minute, then fell silent. Dad was shaking. That was the last we heard of the noise that day. Peyton came by Saturday evening to ask permission to cross our road to collect the equipment. He was so excited. I watched him disappear into the creek bottoms with a sense of tired relief. After the equipment was gone, it would all stop. I couldn't wait to get a full night's sleep. Not a minute later, I spotted Peyton coming back up from the creek. I was confused. It had taken us much longer to set up the camera and speakers, so I assumed it would only take just as long to collect them. My breath stilled when Peyton came closer. He didn't look right. His eyes were wide and his face pale. Something wet dribbled from his chin and onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. My dad caught him before he fell and demanded to know what had happened. Peyton couldn't speak. He just cried. We called his dad. I looked after Peyton as both my dad and his dad went into the bottoms. They were gone for a long time. When they returned, their faces were grim, and they smelled funny. I noticed red on my dad's hands. I asked what was wrong, but they brushed right past me and immediately called the police. Nobody would tell me what had happened. I sat on the couch as a blur of neighbors and police officers swirled around me. At one point, an officer placed something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen curiously. It was the camera from the bottoms. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little banged up. Tiny scratches and dents covered the plastic casing. When I lifted it, my hand stuck to the plastic. Something tacky and odorous covered the screen, but it turned on fine. The first set of photos were normal. Just the pussy willows cast green in the glow of the night setting. As I continued to click through them, they became strange. At one point, the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked from its post. Grass now obscured most of the frame. Flecks of red appeared on the lens and remained for the rest of the sets. One photo made me pause. There was a figure in this one. Or half of a figure, as most of the upper torso hadn't made it into the frame. I thought it could be human, but it didn't look like it should be standing upright. Its legs were twisted like an animal, and it seemed to be having difficulty supporting itself in an upright position. Besides the legs, a long, thin arm hung. Whatever it was must have been stooped over, for its fingertips hung below its crooked knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up and was now being held. The first photo was of the bottoms at night. The next startled me. I had to look closely before deciding what it was. A rabbit had been laid in the bushes, but its ears and most of its scalp had been peeled away. The next was the same rabbit, but a thin, dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its limp body hung like something from a nightmare. In the following photos, more rabbits joined the one, each with their ears and scalp removed. Then a cat, then more cats, then a dog, the yellow lab, then the lion. The following photo was of 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog, and the lion all laid out in a row facing the same way. Their arms and legs had been arranged as if they were marching, like some parade. All of their scalps had been removed, and tiny white glints of their skull could be seen. The last photo was overly bright, like the photo had been taken too close with the flash on. An eye dominated the frame, but it was yellowed and crusty and had a bare pupil like a horse. In the bottom corner, the edge of a mouth could be seen. No lips, just teeth, sharp and little, with wide gaps of red gum between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my dad talking to the police outside. They said the speakers had malfunctioned. The recording had only played the first night.
My name is John Dawson, and I was a beat cop for 22 years in a small town in rural West Virginia. People talk and stories get passed around, especially in a small town with few ears and big mouths. Sometimes the people knew a crime was going to happen before it would, and I was often warned to patrol certain houses for a while. Sometimes nothing happened, and sometimes I would break up a domestic disturbance. I never took it as a psychic thing, but just people who knew other people so well that they could spot the signs. Like nosy old ladies with nothing better to do. I'm going to explain to you the oddest thing that I ever had to investigate, and it changed my life forever. Words are sometimes hard to find when you're talking about trauma, and this I know well from years on the force. The best way I can think of describing is that it was enormous and covered in gray fur, like a wolf, a werewolf. The night started off normally. I was driving around aimlessly watching for bad drivers and some other event that could randomly happen in a small, unknown town. The radio blared, making me jump a little since it had been quiet that night.
Unit 512, you close to Dempsey?
10-4, what's going on?
Neighbors have reported someone or something prowling around in the building. Possible 559.
559 means burglary. Oh joy, I was hoping it was some kid causing terror and not some armed, desperate lunatic trying to break into a gas station at 2 a.m. I drove over that way and searched around the building. In the grassless mud, I saw some enormous paw prints. They were bigger than my palm. Coyote prints aren't nearly that big, and wolves have been extinct in this area for over 100 years now. I thought maybe the coyote had sunk in the mud a little, so the prints spread out, but it didn't appear that way. Station, this is Unit 512, all clear.
10-4, Unit 512.
I chose not to mention the tracks I found, but it stayed in my mind. What could make those prints that big? Also, the callers thought it was a man. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have bothered calling the police over some animal sniffing around a building. I went back to my aimless wandering of the roads, got some food from the fast food joint, and continued. I was parked by an empty car wash, watching tractor trailers amble by every few minutes, eating my dinner. A flash ran past the passenger side door. Beside there was a vast empty parking lot that went to another street. I looked around and didn't see anything. Out of the driver's side door, I saw the biggest wolf I had ever seen, sitting on its haunches and staring at me. After a few seconds, it ran off behind a car wash and probably into the woods because it didn't come back. After snapping back to reality, I put the car in drive and headed down the road. I've been shot at by a drunken redneck hell-bent on getting revenge on his wife's lover, but even that didn't frighten me in the way that seeing that wolf frightened me. When you see something that you know for sure isn't an illusion or a trick of the light, your brain just has trouble accepting it. I drove around for a while, half expecting the thing to run out in front of my headlights.
Unit 512, there's a 1057 over on 22 Brooks Lane. Can you be over there in 5?
10:57 means missing person. It was turning into a night for the record books. 10:04, be there as soon as I can. On came the lights and down went the accelerator. When I got there, I found a man and woman standing on the porch of their old coal camp house. The woman was crying with such fervor that I knew I wouldn't get much from her. The man was pacing. He was clearly distraught as well. Evening, folks. The man walked down and introduced himself as the husband. My daughter, Cassie. My wife went to check on her before she went to bed. Cassie's window was open. Some of the stuff in her room was knocked around like there was a struggle. Neither of us heard anything. I was writing all of this down in my notebook. I'd like to go look, if that's okay with you. Sure, no problem, officer. In the room, I found large claw marks under the window. From the pattern, you could assume this happened when it climbed back out. Quite a lot of her toys were knocked around, and her bedding was essentially shredded. In disbelief, I stared. This was about 5 miles from where I had seen the wolf, but it was the first thing that popped into my head. I couldn't help but ask, "This looks like an animal got in here. Did you hear any howling?" "Yeah, I did. It sounded like one of my neighbor's dogs, so I didn't think of it." "What do you think it was?" "Not sure yet, but I'll add this to my notes. I'm gonna have some more people come by and look." After a couple of hours of checking the scene, the small forensic team left. They found some strands of thick, gray hairs around the room, but no blood. They told me they thought it was an animal too, but they need more evidence to officially call it that. I had about 3 hours left of my shift, so I went back to driving. I was driving along this section of town that used to be part of the coal mining community back in the early 1900s. A lot of the houses were dilapidated and left to rot by the coal companies. I drove past one when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I stopped when I realized what it was. In between 2 abandoned houses, I saw the wolf sitting on its haunches with an unconscious girl in its jaws, grinning. That grin didn't appear to be an animal grin, but like a human. A human who was overjoyed in its success. My instinct was to give chase regardless if it was beast or man. With my Beretta, I went after the thing. I've never seen anything run that fast. In a flash, it was up an old oak tree. I didn't want to shoot because it had the girl and she might still be alive. "Little girl!" I couldn't remember her name. "Are you okay?" I yelled up the tree.
No, she's not.
Said a gravelly voice back to me. Startled, I shouted, "You're a man?"
Oh, yes. Yes, I am. This meal will fill me for a while, too, Officer Dawson. I can't wait.
From the top of the tree, it leaped across the backyard and into the hillside and bolted toward the peak. I fired 3 times but missed. It didn't take long for the wolf to climb over the peak and be out of sight. I was several yards from my car, so I grabbed my cell phone and called the station. "You won't believe this. I just saw the girl. She was in the jaws of some wolf-like thing."
Wolf-like thing?
The station officer asked. "Yes, it spoke to me. It knew my name."
Dawson, there's no way.
"I'm telling you, it did. It went up the hill behind the abandoned houses near the old Campbell mine camp."
I'll get a copter out there ASAP, and as for the wolf, I'll pretend that I didn't hear that, for your sake.
He said and hung up. They sent a copter out, and they did find the girl. Her midsection was devoured. Just bones remained from the chest down. The funeral was rough. The entire small police force that we had attended, and we saluted the girl as she was sent off into the great beyond. My wife handmade them a picture of the multiple pictures of their daughter, Cassie. She was Cassie's homeroom teacher, and she was absolutely destroyed by what had happened. It's been 5 years, and I still don't think she's completely over it. The last event to occur happened a week after. Chief Workman gave me a paid week off over the few days prior. The event of the vicious murder of Cassie had finally started to simmer down. I was cruising through the business section of town a little after midnight, looking the front and back ends of businesses.
Unit 512, come in.
This is Unit 512. Go ahead.
I got a possible 187 down on the far end of Miller Hollow. A driver by said they thought they saw a body in the ditch and didn't want to investigate.
The 187 means murder. Dead body. Great. A good way to start things off after my mini vacation. 10-4, I'll go over that way now. Anxious, but I had a job to do. I went over there to the approximate area. I searched down the road they said the body was spotted, and I found it. The body was covered in deep slashes all over, and to top it off, the head was missing. I shined my flashlight around, trying to find a sign of what might have happened to the head. Several yards up the hillside, I saw a tall, naked man grinning at me. He took off running up the hill, and I never saw him again. The creepiest thing about him was those large, yellow eyes.
I still don't think it's a dog, drawled Rick. Not a dog at all. I rolled my eyes, ready to make the same argument I'd been making for the last week. But the wounds... You think a dog is the only thing that could take a bite out of a man? Rick interrupted. You think a man can't take a bite out of another man? Come off it, I shot back. I know what you're thinking, and I'll say it again. It wasn't old Garrainger that killed those boys. It was a dog. Coyote, probably. Rick sipped his drink pensively, but I knew he wasn't done. I could hear the gears clanking in his skull. You know, he said at last, they found that tribe in Africa, that tribe of, what do you call them? Cannibals? Cannibals, I corrected wearily. Yeah, cannibals, that's what they was. They'd raid neighboring tribes and bring back the fat ones for supper. Oh yeah, a man will take a bite out of another man if he's hungry or mean enough. I gave up. There was no point in arguing with Rick. He got an idea in his head and nothing in all the world could convince him he was wrong. Instead, I just stared out the window at the stretch of darkness between the tavern and the rest of the town. The blackness was formed by a dense spur of woodland spilling off the mountain. The road home passed straight through, plunging briefly into a deep hollow and crossing a sluggish little stream before coming out on the other side. It was there, where no one but the animals and the old hermit Garrainger lived, that the killings happened. The first was that Preston kid. He worked part-time at the tavern, and one night he didn't come home. They found him in the hollow, great chunks of flesh missing from his body. There was no question it was a wild animal that did it. At least, no question, as long as your name wasn't Rick. We started back for home, and as we entered the wood stretch, our debate continued. It couldn't have been old Garrainger, I insisted. Garraingers lived in the hollow longer than anyone can remember, and the killings have only been going on for a week. I felt mighty proud of myself for that bit of deduction, but Rick chuckled grimly and shook his head. I already thought of that one, he retorted. Got it all figured out. You want to know what would make a docile old man turn cannibal all of a sudden? I'll tell you. Cooner. My pace slowed. No, I decided carefully. That can't be. You don't think revenge is enough to turn a man? When I was 11, I replied, my dog Floppy was hit by a truck and killed. Now, I felt all kinds of angry, But I didn't go biting the driver, that did he? You weren't no crazy old hermit neither, muttered Rick. We both were quiet for the next few minutes. Our boots kicked through the rotting leaves, crushing twigs and occasionally scraping against the gravel hidden beneath the autumn detritus. Rick suddenly spoke up. A ridiculous grin slapped across his face. I bet Floppy was pretty floppy after that truck got through with him. I flashed him a baleful glare. That's not funny. Course it is. He shot back, and his booming laugh shook the branches over our heads. It echoed off the distant hills and worked its way back through the dense trees, a distorted shade of what it started out as. Shh! I hissed abruptly, holding up my hand for silence. You hear that? Rick brought his laughter under control and listened. What is that? Coyote, I asserted. Rick craned his neck in the direction of the sound. It was a wild, stuttering howl, high-pitched and screaming. That ain't no coyote. The last traces of laughter vanished from his face, and his skin went pale before my very eyes. The sight gave me goosebumps, and what he said next made my neck prickle. It's human. We exchanged a quick glance, and all arguments of cannibalism and not funny jokes were dropped as we ran toward the noise. Rick was already reaching for his gun. Most guys who walked that road carried one these days. As we raced, the sound began to fade. The howls gave way to moans. The moans died away to silence. Soon the audio trail was lost completely, and we came to a panting stop. It's gone, growled Rick. I flashed my light about the woods, trying to chase away the shadows. There was a trunk of a huge oak tree, the scraggly branches of a thorn bush, and wait a second. There, behind the oak tree, something moved. Rick, over there! We trotted to the spot where we had seen... what? It vanished too quickly for me to positively identify. It might have been a tail, or it might have been a coat sleeve. Already my memory was distorting it. A sick groan drew my attention back to Rick, who was shining his light down at his feet. What is it? I asked. I stepped in it, Rick responded weakly, pointing at the ground in front of him. I nearly threw up when I saw it. I probably would have recognized the guy's face if I could have seen it, but it had been ripped clean off, gnawed to a bloody pulp. That was the worst of the damage, but there were great crescent-shaped gouges throughout the rest of the body as well. Who do you suppose it is? Rick asked with a tremor in his voice. I shook my head. Something in my stomach was blowing bubbles. Big bubbles that released showers of gritty mud when they popped, as I looked at the boot-shaped dent where Rick had inadvertently stumbled over the corpse. You still think it's old Garrainger? I asked cynically. I know it is. He raised his flashlight to reveal a winding path branching off to the depths of the hollow. It was the road to Garrainger's cabin. That doesn't prove anything, I snapped. No? I bet if we paid old Garrainger a visit right now, he would have blood on his beard. Rick started down the path, and I tried to stop him. Whoa. You're not... Of course I am, Rick interrupted. I'm gonna drag that cannibal out of his sorry excuse for a house and bring him to justice. Just you wait and see. As soon as that crazy's behind bars, the killings will stop. I guarantee it. Before I could say anything, he was gone, loping down the road with his gun held ready. I couldn't let him go alone, so I chased after him. Wait a minute, I called. Suppose you are right. Remember when they found that Wilmot guy? Anthony. Yeah, what of it? Come on, I pressed. You remember Anthony Wilmot? The guy was huge, and it wasn't baby fat. Suppose you're right, and Garrainger is the one who did them all in.
You're just gonna lay hands on a crazy who killed a strong guy like Anthony Wilmot?
Bet Anthony didn't have this, though, Rick replied, brandishing his gun. Besides, you got my back, don't you?
Garrainger's cabin loomed out of the trees in front of us. By this point of the road, if you could even call it that anymore, had become so overgrown it was a wonder the old hermit could get his old rusty pickup in and out for groceries. Rick went right up to the door and banged the handle of his gun on the woodwork.
Open up, Garrainger. Me and a friend would like a word with you.
Hey, I hissed, tugging on Rick's arm as he waited for an answer. Look at this. I pointed at the weathered boards beneath our feet. A line of dark spots, brown in the glow from our flashlights, led across the porch and ended at the door.
Convinced yet?
Snarled Rick.
The old crazy couldn't even bother to clean up his trail. That's what cannibalism will do to you. Turn your brain inside out.
There'd been no sound from inside the house, so Rick knocked again, harder.
You got 5 seconds to open this door, Garrainger, or I'll knock it down.
I still couldn't believe it, even as I stared at the morbid stains by my feet. Did Cooner's death really make the old man snap? Was he chewing up the townsfolk out of revenge? I shivered as pinpricks danced up my arms. I'd been one of the men who showed up that afternoon, accompanied by a band of others from town.
Cooner's gotta go,
the leader of our little hunting party said when Garrainger met us on the porch.
Little Ruthie's in the hospital. Might have rabies.
Garrainger protested, but we were firm. 2 of us held him back while a few more went inside to fetch the dog. It was a nasty creature, mostly skin and bones, but with a savage bundle of muscle in all the right places, so you know it could mess you up bad if you weren't careful. How anyone could love a pet like that was beyond me. It was Ruthie's father who pulled the trigger and ended Cooner's life. Old Garrainger was distraught, but we all agreed it was for the best. Couldn't have a monster like that running loose, not with children around.
That's it. I warned him.
Rick's resigned sigh broke me from my reverie. He took a step back and planted one boot against the door. It held fast at first, but a few more kicks splintered the rustic lock.
All righty, Garrainger, we know.
Rick stumbled to a halt, and I nearly ran into him. It was pitch black in Garrainger's one-room cabin, but our flashlights picked out the continuing trail of blood and followed it across the cluttered floor. Clothes, furniture, cookware. It seemed the old hermit's house was hit by a whirlwind. The blood trail meandered through the mess and terminated next to a dirty mattress. The blankets were tousled and knotted around an irregular shape. We both stood motionless for a second as we processed the scene. Then Rick stepped forward, much of the confidence gone from his stride. He reached out and pulled back the sheets. "Well," I admitted nervously, he does have blood in his beard, and even some meat in his mouth," agreed Rick, his face turning green. "But I think it's his own." He dropped the corner of the blanket, blessedly hiding what was left of the old man's face. "We should get out of here," I recommended. "Get back to town and report the bodies." Rick nodded and turned gratefully away from the hermit's corpse. Together we made our way to the door, and as our flashlight beam swept across the opening, something black sped across the porch.
"What was that?"
gasped Rick, seizing my arm in a painful grip. "Animal," I breathed.
"Ain't no animal I ever saw. Didn't make no noise when it ran by."
The words were barely out of his mouth when a hollow thumping tore through the air, a mad racing rhythm punctuated by the harsh tick of something hard scratching against the wood. I knew that sound instantly. Floppy used to make it when he'd go tearing along the hardwood floors of my parents' house. "Let's go," I urged once the noise was gone. Rick was close behind me. We cast our lights back and forth as we reached the door, searching the porch for any sign of what we had just seen or heard. But there was nothing. I tried to keep my pace even as we made our way back to the road, but Rick kept kicking my heels, and before I knew it, we were running. The woods were full of sounds, the ruckus of our hurried footfalls, the wind in the leaves overhead, the cracking and breaking of twigs behind and to either side.
I still don't think it was a dog.
Rick wheezed. My frustration with Rick's stubbornness boiled over, and I shouted back at him.
Well, what do you think it was then? A chipmunk?
I shot him an angry look over my shoulder, and in that moment, I failed to see the tree root rising from the road.
Shit.
I went down hard, with my face buried in a stinking pile of damp leaves, and Rick followed suit, stumbling over me with a cry of surprise. My flashlight went rolling off into the forest, throwing its golden beam wildly through the foliage before coming to rest about 5 feet away. Rick kept hold of his, and I found myself staring directly into its blinding glare.
Oh, get that thing out of my face,
I groaned, shoving his arm aside so I could see.
You shouldn't have been following me so close.
Rick's expression froze the words on my tongue. His cheeks were covered in mud from a spill, and his eyes bugged out of his head like golf balls. He wasn't looking at me, but rather something behind me. Before I could react, he held his gun out, and I rolled out of the way just before he pulled the trigger. "Watch it!" I screamed, although I could barely hear my own voice from the explosion rattling around inside my head. Rick leapt to his feet, his weapon still held out in front of him, and I turned to see what he was aiming at. Nothing.
Are you crazy?
I screamed, punching him in the arm as hard as I could.
You almost blew my head off.
Rick's hand was shaking violently, and I noticed his chin was quivering.
It was right there,
he whimpered.
I saw it. I saw it.
Saw what? I demanded. But instead of answering, he began spinning around, pointing his gun every which way as though responding to noises I couldn't hear.
Run,
he snarled.
Don't look back, just run.
He gave me a rough shove and I obeyed. Rick's mind was crumbling, and I didn't want to be caught in the dark woods when it gave way completely and he started scattering bullets. The trees began to thin out, and the moon worked its way through the canopy to illuminate our path. Ahead, I could see the lights of the town growing closer. Rick's footsteps pounded to my left and a little behind, his raspy whisper chanting,
Don't look back. Don't look back. Don't look.
I spun just in time to see Rick's hands vanish into the bush by the side of the road.
Rick!
I shouted, drawing my gun and sprinting to the place where he had disappeared. Without thinking, I thrust my hand into the underbrush and immediately withdrew it with a cry of disgust. My fingers came back warm and wet. A violent din erupted from the bushes. Leaves thrashed back and forth. Something thumped heavily against the dirt, and Rick's voice rose above it all, high and shrill and unbearable. All reason left me, like a hatch fell open and dumped it all right there. I never commanded my legs to move, but they did, pumping up and down without feeling. I was there that afternoon. I joined the hunt. Mine was a face it would recognize. The freezing night air was sucked in and squeezed out of my lungs by the same machine-like force that propelled my feet. Clouds of it billowed in front of my eyes. Behind me, I could hear, surely as the drumbeat of my own heart, a heavy panting. I could hear the leaves and gravel in my wake being torn up by something hard and sharp. And in the back of my mind, I felt a rising howl. At last, I burst out of the trees, and the road was paved and lined with street lamps. Still, I kept running, obedient to Rick's final mandate. Don't look back. Not until I passed the first several rows of houses did I slow and risk a backwards glance. I could see the shadow of the hollow rising, spreading, scratching against the moonlit sky. For a second, I thought I saw 2 pricks of crimson, but those were gone so quickly, they might have only been my imagination. There are stories as old as humanity about strange beings that appear out of nowhere, that come to warn you of terrible things in the future. Traditionally, these things are called omens. Black cats, white dogs, banshees, etc. Modern science can tell you that there is no credence to these and there are no facts to base these claims. In 1968, not long before his passing, the town hired a man to record the story told by my great-great-grandfather, Cristiano Brivio. I'm writing down his recollection of my own town's most infamous stories, the tale of Bright Eyes, and including bits of my own research into this strange, terrifying tale.
It was the year 1908. I had just arrived from New York City to the town of Coburg, Pennsylvania. As a young 18-year-old man, I was excited to start my fresh life in New York City. When I arrived, however, there were men at the docks recruiting workers for various coal companies along the Appalachians. The man who recruited us surprised us by speaking particularly good Italian, and we were drawn in by his promises of decent wages and a place to live. At the time, much like today, coal was the main source of income for most of the Appalachian region, especially southern Pennsylvania, and it was a booming industry. Little did we know that a war was looming, and the demand would increase even more. My brother and I couldn't speak English then, so we felt alone with the other men that
Here, my grandfather's words were lost in a fit of wheezing coughs that came so hard he almost couldn't catch his breath. Black lung had been devouring him for years at this point, and would eventually take his life less than a year later.
Are you okay, sir?
The man recording asked.
Yes, I'm fine. I'll just drink some water and I'll be fine.
He took a few gulps.
That's better. Now, in my time, men worked hard for little pay and worked long hours to keep their families fed. We knew it was dangerous work, but our choices were either to suffer a bit and fill our bellies or face the torture of starvation. Yes, I admit I witnessed Bright Eyes myself in the fall of that year.
He said as he began to cough violently again.
Sir, are you sure you want to do this? You don't have to.
I want people to know that we weren't delusional or just seeing things. It really happened. We're not liars. I don't care if it ruins my reputation. I don't have long on this earth anyways, so my reputation means little to me now.
Okay, we'll continue when you're feeling better. I will pause the recording until then.
It continued with a click.
The evening shift was preparing to go inside, waiting for day shift to come out of mine number 4. When we all heard this ungodly scream come from the forest, some of the men ignored it, thinking it was a wolf or a mountain lion, started to head inside. We heard a loud ruckus coming from the forest, like a herd of buffaloes that was charging at us. We stood there startled, as we saw this enormous, cat-like beast burst forth from the dark forest and slowly trot its way inside the entrance of mine number 4. It walked like, what's the term, like it owned the place. It was as if it were taunting us to do something to it.
He coughed lightly this time and kept his composure.
I was the first to spot it coming from the woods, but since my English was terrible, I couldn't find the words to alert the rest of the men. All of us told the investigators the same details, that its body was at least 12 feet long. It had the whitest fur we had ever seen on a living creature, like it was pure snow, and it had these enormous bright eyes, like the headlights of a car. Its body was long and slender, like a panther, but bulky and muscular like a tiger. 2 long fangs hung over its bottom lip, going about 6 inches below its jaw. There is no animal on Earth that looks anything like that beast. Not even close. When the beast went inside,
he said.
the roof collapsed in one of the sections, and 22 men were killed, including my brother, Al. God rest his soul. None of us saw it come back out. After the incident, we took to calling the thing Bright Eyes. All of us men who had reported to have seen Bright Eyes were dismissed as being hysterical from the accident, like those who would later go on to fight in the Great War. None of us were taken seriously. We were examined by numerous medical doctors, but no shrinks. Psychiatry was still a new thing, so nobody considered it. We were just dismissed as crazies. Police investigators questioned us, but they waited for the results from the doctors. We didn't hear from them about the incident after that. But it happened a second time a few months later. At mine number 2 this time. The beast started out of the woods after a long howling scream. It looked into the mine and boom! 12 men dead from another roof collapse. Those men told the same tales as we had, so the mine owners started listening. They hired these 2 local drunks to find the beast and kill it. I believe the 2 men were named John Fink and Henry Irving. They were notoriously unreliable workers, so I think the mine owners only hired them because they were dumb enough to do it. We all told them whereabout we thought the beast emerged from, so they searched the area and came back a few hours later. They claimed they found a trail that led up to the creature's lair. They said they were going to camp around the lair, wait for the beast to come out, and fill it with shotgun slugs. Only, that's not how things turned out. The next afternoon, after a few hours passed when they were supposed to report in, the bosses sent out a search party. They were found sitting back to back between some trees, clutching their rifles to their chests, and their hair was completely bleached white. The rumor around town was that they were shipped off to an asylum after raving about a creature with glowing eyes that was going to come after them. To hear John and Henry tell it, they said that they had spent the night getting drunk off some whiskey they decided to bring along, and wound up passed out in their tent. As they slept in their drunken slumber, the beast came up to the tent they were staying in, yanked it off the ground with its teeth, and stared at them for a while. And that was all they could remember. I don't know if any of that is true, but I never saw them after that. A couple of men who found them said that their hair was, indeed, white as snow.
Upon further research, I did find out that these men had lived in the town and that they mysteriously disappeared around the time of the mine accidents. I couldn't confirm if they had gone to an asylum and found no evidence of their hair turning white, but Grandpa Chris insisted it was all real. He goes on.
After the second appearance of Bright Eyes, the bosses hired a security company called Watson and Pickett to guard the workers. They sent 10 armed men per shift to stand around the entrance and were told to shoot any strange-looking animals that approached the mine. The final time Bright Eyes came, the guards saw it coming. They waited for it to come within range and opened fire with their rifles. Keep in mind, some of these guys fought in the Spanish-American War or had some kind of military training, so they were good shots. The beast continued walking as if the bullets hadn't touched its flesh. They appeared to just go right through it. The guards stood in amazement as it walked by them, unwounded. 2 of them tried to block it from going inside, firing at close range or at point-blank range. But it simply gave an ear-screeching roar, and the men ran in fear. Before it went inside mine number 1, it turned and looked at the men, giving one final ear-piercing scream. It strutted inside, not seeming to care we were all standing close by. There was an explosion this time, killing 33 men. almost the entire shift. After that, they closed all the mines in our town, and we all started traveling a little further to the next town over for work.
I decided for the sake of the story that I would do my own investigation. I traveled to the town, now a brimming miniature city, complete with its own Walmart. The area where the abandoned mines were had gone untouched for all this time that had passed. I traced the area where my grandpa had seen the creature and scouted the area for clues. The mines were sealed, and the one that had exploded had a plaque embedded into the concrete seal commemorating the disaster and the dead men. I searched the area, looking for proof of bright eyes. I didn't find anything substantial then. The mountain is vast, and I found an old trail that went around it, where I found an opening in the mountainside. As I approached the entrance, I heard a loud, ear-piercing scream. Inside the cave, I could see something glowing very faintly near the distant rear. I didn't stay there long. The place just gave me creeps. The trail back down the hill was worn, well-traveled, but I stumbled a few times. My knees slammed into the rocky soil, sending a shock of pain up my legs, but I scrambled to my feet and kept on as the blood trickled down my shins. I was almost to the bottom when something tackled me from behind. In my ear, hot breath steamed from a warm, wet nose of some large animal. I could hear its sticky lips part as it sniffed my hair and my flesh, maybe surveying me for weakness. The warm, barbed tongue of the creature lapped across my neck and the back of my head, perhaps to see if I was a worthwhile meal. The creature decided I wasn't satisfactory and it moved off of me. I rolled over to make sure it was leaving and not simply waiting for me to get up before it attacked. I watched as this huge white cat hiked its way up the hill back to its lair in the cave I had just left. As the creature entered the cave, from behind me, several hundred feet away, a huge part of the mountain gave way.